So we're actually going to be doing a coding tutorial today. I normally don't do tutorial videos because I don't watch them. It's faster for me just to read the documentation. But I know a lot of you guys want to start the next big software as a service startup like Slack or Dropbox or Discord, and maybe you're not sure where to start. For me, when I started web development a few years ago, the most frustrating thing is that a lot of it has nothing to do with the fundamentals of programming. It's just all these miscellaneous facts, and then you have to pick them up along the way. So this tutorial has two objectives. First, I want to explain web development to someone who was in my position a few years ago where I had the core coding skills, but I didn't know how to make web apps. And then the second objective of this tutorial is to help you make some starter code for your next big SaaS project. So this is definitely not going to be the most fully featured starter code. And if you're looking for that, then I recommend just going on Google and finding something better. But I personally like using starter code that's very minimal and that I actually wrote myself so that I understand how to customize everything. So if you're going to spend the time watching this ridiculously long video, then I definitely recommend actually following along on your computer and writing the code yourself, because the only way that you can learn web development is by actually doing it. I'm going to be doing all the coding today on Windows, but all the tools I'm going to be using, except for this one tiny little thing that I'll point out later, all those tools are going to be also available on Mac. Let's get started with a demo of what we're going to be building. We're going to be keeping the features in this tutorial to the absolute minimum that you need to launch a SaaS web app. First, because we want to focus on understanding the code we write, and second, because if you're building a startup, you want to be launching as fast as possible. You don't want to be bogged down by unnecessary stuff. So we're going to have this landing page, and on the landing page is going to be the sign up form and also a link to a login page. Let's go back. If we sign up, we're going to get directed to the main page, and this is the page that you will replace with whatever functionality that your web app is actually supposed to do. On the side, we have these different links here. You can easily add more links. We're only going to be adding a billing page, and the billing page will be integrated with Stripe so the user can subscribe to a monthly plan if they want. And then finally, they can press the logout button to go back to the home page. You might think that this is a little bit lame, but there's actually a ton of code to understand here. And if you understand all of it, then you're well on your way to building a very complicated SaaS app. One last thing before we get started. One of the really awesome things about web development is that all the popular tools and frameworks are either free or there's a very generous free plan that you can get started with. But the one thing that you will inevitably have to pay for is hosting, because you have to put your website on the internet, right? But don't worry, I got your back, because this video is sponsored by Hostinger. Using Hostinger, you'll be able to set up a fast and reliable virtual private server, or VPS, in minutes for only a few dollars a month. At the end of this video, I'm going to be showing you how I like to set up a Node.js web app onto a Linux server. And you can follow that part of the video with any VPS provider, but Hostinger VPS is particularly simple to set up. If you're a beginner, it's really nice because they walk you through all the steps. And one thing I like about it is that they make it very affordable to enable daily backups. And this is just a very straightforward thing you can do to make sure that you don't lose any of your user data. You can get up to 91% off by going to hostinger.com/WillQuant with the coupon code WillQuant. That's it. Let's start coding. The first thing you're going to want to do is download Node.js and MongoDB. This is a very common backend for a web app, and MongoDB is just a very easy database to get started with. We're going to be doing all our coding in JetBrains WebStorm, and I would have preferred to choose a free IDE for this tutorial, but I am a huge JetBrains fanboy and I don't really know how to use anything else. So you can get started with their free 30-day free trial, and then after that it's pretty cheap. Once you've installed those three things, you're going to want to open up JetBrains WebStorm and then hit create a new project. We're going to be creating a Node.js Express app. Express is the framework that you use to build web applications on top of Node.js. I'm going to put this on my desktop so you can see it on my screen here, and I'm going to call it SaaS tutorial. Leave these things the same, but we're going to be using EJS as the view engine. All of these are totally fine. They're all capable of doing what we need, but I like to use EJS. Now hit create. JetBrains will automatically generate some starter code for us. So the first thing we're going to do is run the starter code by hitting this run button on the top right corner. And then you're going to see in the console, it says listening on port 3000. What does that mean? Basically, we are running the web server on our own computer, and port 3000 identifies where on our computer that the web server is running. So if I'm going to open up my browser, I recommend using Chrome because they have good developer tools. You type in localhost to identify your own computer, then 3000 to identify your web server. And now this is the starter code that JetBrains has generated for us. Unfortunately, the JetBrains starter code is actually a little bit confusing in my opinion. So we're going to clean it up a little bit, and in the process I'm going to teach you about how Node and Express works. So expand the project directory and you're going to see this folder called routes. Now Express has this concept called a router. It's just an unnecessary software design thing, and I think that for learning Express it actually makes it more confusing. So we're going to delete this folder. Right click, delete. And then inside app.js, this is where most of our code is located. We want to delete all the references to the files that were inside routes. So that's the index router and the users router up here. And also down here, app.use/users. Delete that. Shift F10 on Windows to rerun it. And then I can refresh Chrome. And now we see this error page, not found 404. Why are we getting that? Well, let's take a look at the code. There is this useful comment here that says catch 404 and forward to error handler. So we were probably suspecting that this piece of code is running. Why is this piece of code running? And I can explain that to you by explaining how this file is formatted and basically how Express works. So at the top of app.js, you have all these statements that are like var, blah, 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 equals require, blah, blah, blah. These are importing the different modules that you'll be using in your project. Then after that, we are setting up Express, our framework for developing web applications. Here, you don't need to worry about app.set that much. We're not going to be using that. But after that is what's interesting. App.use, you see all these app.use statements, right? And inside them, these are called middleware functions. So what is happening is every time the browser hits a URL path on our web server, all the middleware functions inside app.use get called in order. So it'll be logger gets called, then express.json get called, then express.url encoder gets called, and so on until we eventually get this error handler over here. But you may be asking, this looks a little bit funny, right? It says app.use logger. This looks like a function call. So shouldn't this just be executed right when the server starts up, kind of like all these require statements up here? And this is actually confusing. But if you look into the definition of logger, that's Control B on Windows or Command B on Mac, you will actually see that this is returning another function. It's returning another function. So that function gets stored inside Express, and then Express says, okay, every time a browser hits a URL that's on our web server, we're going to call all those functions that were stored inside app.use. We're going to call them all in order. And let me prove that to you. So when I refresh the page right now, right, we can see these log statements, get/404. Well, what happens if I remove the logger? Comment that out and then restart again, refresh the page. I can keep refreshing, but I'm not going to get any log statements. So how do we stop this error from showing up? Well, what we want is something to happen before these two middleware functions get called. And then we want to stop the execution flow. So we want to render the old page that was previously being shown. That's actually this index.ejs file that's inside the views folder. And then we want to stop the execution flow so that these two functions aren't called. We do this by creating a request handler. What is a request? Every time the browser or any other client, it could be the terminal for example, but anytime something hits a URL path on our web server, that is called a request. And to define a request handler function, you can use app.get and then specify the URL path. And this is called the endpoint. So from now I'm just going to call the URL path the endpoint. Our request handler takes in a request, a response, and a next function. The request object is what we use to retrieve data that's passed in from the browser, but we don't need that at the moment. What we want to do right now is use the response object to tell the browser to render index.ejs. Render index. That's it. So restart. Oh, look at this. title is not defined. Why is that? And that's why we need to learn EJS. So if we look at index.ejs, this is just basic HTML. So a little bit of history about web development. Basically, all browsers use this thing called HTML to render a web page. You can view the HTML by right-clicking, inspect, and this is it. It's a very ugly language invented in the 1980s for formatting documents and stuff. We just use it today because the big companies decide that we're going to use it. So if we are just sending an HTML file from the server to the browser, this is actually very boring, right? It's just a plain file. I want to be able to change the file. I want to be able to change the HTML file depending on some cool computations or data processing that I'm doing on my server, right? I want it to be not a static website. So you can do that using EJS. If you look at index.ejs, this is plain HTML. I'll get a little bit more into how to work with HTML later, but take a look at this stuff. You see this angle bracket percentage equals title. What does that mean? It basically means our server is going to populate this thing with a variable that we pass in, and then it's going to create the HTML file that we then send to the browser to render. So we just need to pass in this title variable. So you pass in a JavaScript object with a title property, and we're going to call it SaaS tutorial. Okay, Shift F10, restart, and there you go. This next argument inside the request handler we just defined is also pretty important. So if I call that instead of calling res.render, what's going to happen is it's going to say, oh, just go on to the next middleware function, which is this one, and so it will show us the 404 error page again. Let's revert that. And now it's time to learn a little bit of HTML and put a sign up form inside our home page. So very common for a SaaS web app to have a sign up form on the front page that leads them to some sort of free trial or something, right? So in order to do that, you use a form. A form is what lets you collect data from the user. Inside the form, you have inputs to define the different fields you want. We're going to say this input is required because they have to fill it out. The type, there's a bunch of predefined input types in HTML. This is email. The name is how we refer to this piece of data in our server. We're also using email. And then a placeholder for what the user sees when it's blank. So we'll just say your email. And we also want a password, so also make it required the type is password. If you're wondering how I remember all this stuff, it's because I just use it a lot, but I don't actually know that much HTML in general. So you pick it up along the way. Enter a password. And then finally, we need a submit button. So we're going to say type equals submit, and then the text inside the button is sign up for a free trial. Rerun, and there's our sign up form. How do we pass this data, the email and the password, back to the server? And we do that using something called a post request. Remember, we created a get request handler over here. Well, a post request handler is basically the same thing. The main difference is that you use app.post, and functionality wise, it's better for sending more sensitive data from the browser, because if you use a get request, what's going to happen is that the email and the password that the user submits will just show up in the URL, and then our server will be retrieving that data by looking at the URL. But we do not want to do that for email and password, so instead you use a post request. For now, we do not need to render anything. We just need to learn how to retrieve the data, and that is accessible from rec.body. I'm going to log rec.body, but I'm going to put a breakpoint here so I can show you how to use the debugger in WebStorm. Always figure out how to use the debugger when you're starting to use a new IDE. We need to define the endpoint for this post request. I will say sign up, and then inside index.ejs, you have to say action equals sign up. And the method has to be post because by default, it will be get. Hit this little bug icon here, or it's Shift F9. refresh. I'm going to say q at q.q, sign up for a free trial. Okay, we hit the breakpoint. Expand the rec. And we want to look at body. And we can see our email and password over here. So this is good. And now we want to be able to somehow save this so that we can create a user, right? We're going to learn how to set up our Mongo database. And there's going to be a little bit of Windows specific stuff that I'm going to show you here. So I'm sorry if you're using Mac, but this is a very short section. And I'm sure you can find a very quick instruction article on how to just start running Mongo database on your Mac. So you have to use this program called MongoD that comes installed by default when you install MongoDB. But if I just type in MongoD into my command prompt, you'll just see that it says MongoD is not recognized and is an internal or external command. And the reason is because I actually have to navigate to this folder. It's like C program files. I think it's Mongo. No, something like, yeah, Mongo, and then server, and then the version of MongoDB, and then bin, and then finally I see this MongoD.exe thing that I can run, right? But this is kind of a pain in the ass. I don't want to have to navigate to this folder in my terminal every time I want to run a Mongo database. I actually want to just, do one line of code in my terminal, run my database, and then stop using this piece of crap that's the Windows command prompt. I'd rather use my beautiful cross-platform tools like JetBrains. So a very useful trick that you'll probably use a lot in Windows development, search for edit the system environment variables. Environment variables, look in system variables, look for path, and then all these folders that are in the environment variable. Basically, this means that you can access these folders anywhere from your terminal, no matter what your current directory is. So what you want to do is copy that directory, make a new environment, or make a new part to this path, paste it in, okay, and now if I restart my command prompt, doesn't matter where I am, I'm going to go to my desktop. You can see that it runs now, but it's not running properly yet. Why? Because we need a folder to store all our files in the database. So we can just create a new folder any way you want. I'll call it SaaS tutorial data. Put it up here. And then type in mongo d-db path / SaaS tutorial data. Now our Mongo database is running, and we never have to touch this CMD prompt again in this tutorial. We now have our Mongo database set up, but that's not enough. We need to learn how to communicate with our Mongo database from our web server. And this is like the fundamental concept of web development. You have all these separate programs running on different servers or the same server, and you have to learn how to communicate between those different programs. So to get the Node server talking to the Mongo database, you use something called Mongoose. What's Mongoose? Well, look at the top of the file. Remember, you see all these require statements? We're just going to require another node module. Mongoose equals require. Mongoose. We do have to install this module though, and we do that using npm. That's what you use to install modules. You can also use yarn, but npm is like the older one. Npm install -save. -save is not important right now. It just basically means if you're working with some other people, they can very easily install all the same modules that you did. Mongoose. Hit that. And once that's done, you're going to need to use Mongoose to connect to the database. Mongoose.connect. You have to pass in a string to identify the database. I don't remember what the format of the string is, so I need to copy it. It's like this: MongoDB : / localhost 27017. 27017 is the port number that the Mongo database will run on by default. as you can see in the command prompt over here. You probably don't need to change it, so just use that. After that, you can name the database whatever you want. I'll call it SaaS tutorial DB, and then let's run the code. Well, we have some deprecation warnings here. These are not important. Mongoose has already successfully connected because these are just warnings, but we probably want to get rid of the warnings, right? So let's just do as they tell us to do. Pass option use new URL parser equals true. Do I know what this means? No, but I just want to get rid of the warning. The other one is use unified topology, true. Run again. And now Mongoose is successfully connected to MongoDB. Now we need to define the data structure of the information we're saving. And we're going to do that by creating a new file called models.js. I like to keep my data structures separate from the core application logic, but you don't have to do that. Inside models.js, you also need to require Mongoose. And then you do something like mongoose.model. And then what you pass in is the string to identify the model, and we're going to call it a user. And then a schema, which is basically a mapping from the name of the property you want to save to the type of that property. Mongoose.schema. For now, we just care about the email, which is a string, and the password, which is also a string. But we don't actually want to save the password just by itself because this is very insecure. In case your server gets hacked, you do not want the user's password to be leaked because some people like to use the same password for many different accounts. So instead, we save what's called a password hash, which is basically a more secure version of the password that you can still use to verify that the user entered in the correct credentials, but you will not, like for some hacker that finds out about the password hash, they will not be able to reverse engineer the original password. Now that we have the user model defined, we can require the models file inside app.js. // just means that the models file is in the same directory as app.js, and we do not need to store this into a variable because we just need this code to execute. If we require it, this code will execute. After it executes, we can get the user model. Var user equals mongoose.model user. And once we have that model, we can instantiate a specific user when somebody signs up. So we can use let, which basically keeps the variable within the scope of this function. Let new user equals new user. And we pass in the email, which is rec.body.email, and the password hash. How do we generate the password hash? Think about it for a minute. Think about it. You guessed it. We are going to install another npm module. You will get used to this eventually. When you have another problem, just look up what module to install. npm install --save bcrypt is what you're going to use. Don't ask me how bcrypt works. I'm not really sure. Once that's done, you can do var bcrypt equals require bcrypt. Bcrypt. Now, there's two functions you can use. One is like called hash, and the other one is called hash sync. Debatable which one that you should be using, but I'm just going to use the one that's more straightforward for this tutorial, which is hash sync. Pass in rec.body.password, and you also need to pass in a number. The number is basically representing how secure you want this hash to be. The bigger it is, the more secure it is, but also the slower it will be. So I checked some websites and 10 seems to be a pretty popular number. I'm not sure what is a good practice, but we will use 10. Once that's done, we can just do new user.save, and that should save our model. If we go to localhost 3000, let's actually create queue at queue.queue, password queue. It is not going to render anything yet, but hopefully it will be saved. Now, how do we check that we actually saved this user in our database? And now it's time to open up a Mongo database viewer. By default, when you install MongoDB, you'll get this program called MongoDB Compass. This is a GUI for viewing your database, but it's super laggy. So instead, I like to use this one called Robo3T. It's much faster, it's pretty simple, and it's also cross-platform. So I am going to open that up. You want to hit create. Then all these fields here, assuming that you started up your Mongo database with the default settings, you don't actually have to change any of this. See, if you click test, you should get these 2 check marks. Now save it, double click the new connection you just saved, and now you can see the SaaS tutorial database that you created. Inside collections, there is users, and we have the user. I actually created 2 of these users, which leads to another important point. We do not want to create a user if a user with the same email already exists. I am just going to manually delete one of these, right click, delete document. Each of these Mongo database objects is called a document. And now we need to modify the signup code so that it only creates a new user if the email doesn't already exist. We need to be able to check, is there a user in our database that has the same email as the one in the form? So user.find1. The email, we're going to pass in the one that was submitted in the form. So this is going to say, hey, try to find a user in the database with the same email as the one that the user just submitted in the form. And then you have to pass in a callback function. The 2 arguments are error or the user. Now, if there is an error, there should not be an error, because even regardless of whether or not this user actually exists, the query should be able to run successfully. So there shouldn't be an error. But in case there is, we're just going to go on to the next middleware function and handle the error. So we can do something like if error, return next error. Now, if the user exists, we want to return a custom error. Let's say you use a message property to define the error message. I want to say user already exists. And then finally, the user doesn't exist and we didn't have an error. Let's do this. Let's rerun. First, I'm going to try to create queue at queue.queue again. It should give me an error. Yes, user already exists. But what if I do w at w.w? It's not going to render anything because we didn't tell it to render anything. But if we check our database viewer, hit the play button to refresh, oh look, there is another document, w at w.w. How convenient. It would be nice if we made this landing page a little bit prettier. We're not going to be doing too much fancy front-end stuff in this tutorial, but I will be showing you a little bit about Bootstrap and CSS and how you can find a theme and modify it to suit your needs. I'm a big fan of doing features end-to-end. I like having things that are presentable to people as early as possible. So I wouldn't be the kind of guy who just writes a ton of back-end code and then waits a long time to actually make it look pretty. A lot of you guys ask me why I don't use front-end JavaScript frameworks like Vue or React, and to quickly answer that, it is because it's usually not a high priority to have a very highly interactive front end with a lot of cool rendering and animation stuff. You usually just want to focus on getting the functionality really useful and then just making it overall formatted nicely. We're going to be using a site I really like called startbootstrap.com to download some Bootstrap themes. And the one that we're going to start with for the landing page is the creative theme. I really like it. You can check out the live preview here. Once you've downloaded and extracted everything, you want to copy CSS folder, IMG folder, JS folder, and vendor folder into the public folder of your project. You do not need all the files inside these folders, but I'm not going to waste time to pick and choose the stuff you actually need. Then you're going to copy index.html into the views folder. I know there's been a lot of talk about plagiarism on YouTube recently, so I thought it'd be important to give you a good tutorial on plagiarism today. Rename your index.ejs, your old one, to old index.ejs. We don't need it anymore, but I just want to keep it around so I can look at it. And then your new index.html file, name it index.ejs. Now, if I rerun the code, refresh, I have our fancy new landing page. So let me give you the quick overview of how HTML and Bootstrap works. HTML is basically just a bunch of tags that defines the structure of the web page. And usually there is an opening tag and a closing tag. So as you can see, the opening tag for the header, which is this big section over here, and the closing tag of the header. And then in the middle is all the stuff that's in the header. And WebStorm conveniently lets you collapse and expand stuff so you can sort of see the bigger structure of things. Bootstrap is just a framework on top of HTML to make it easier to design pages that are responsive to different screen sizes. And all you need to know about Bootstrap to start off is that you have a bunch of rows. So, for example, this first big section would be like a row. This section could be like a row. This section could be like a row. And then inside the rows, you have columns. Let's take a look at this at your service section. I'm going to search for at your service. Okay, so that's this section right here. So you can see, here is the row, and then inside it you have this column LG3 and column MD6. What does that mean? Well, in Bootstrap, each row can have up to 12 columns. So what this is saying here is, on large screens, I want this element, which is this sturdy themes thing over here. I want this element to take up 1/4 of the screen on large screens, because 3/12, 1/4. So on the large screen size, you can see it takes up 1/4. But on medium screen sizes, I want to take up 6/12, which is half the screen size. And you can see it does that, see? On the medium screen size, it only takes up half. So essentially, Bootstrap is just defining a grid, and then you can modify the amount of columns that some element is taking in the grid, depending on the size of the screen. Obviously, there are a lot more intricacies. To design a landing page like this from scratch, you would actually need to know those intricacies of Bootstrap, and you'd also need to be a good UX designer, and these things are over the scope of this tutorial. So instead, I'll just show you how to look for specific things inside the HTML and modify it to your needs. So we don't actually want all this stuff here. I'm going to delete everything between the footer and the header element. One neat trick you can do in Chrome, if you right-click Inspect, when you hover over the HTML, it actually highlights the corresponding section of the page so you know what it is. Also very convenient that this theme happens to have very well commented code. So we're just going to find this About section and start deleting everything down until we get to the footer. If you're just modifying HTML, you actually don't have to restart the server. You can just refresh. And all that stuff is gone now. Let's find where this title is defined, Creative Start Bootstrap Theme. That's going to be at the top of the page in these title tags. So we'll call it SaaS Tutorial. This part, your favorite source of free Bootstrap themes. Let's search for that. Your favorite part of free Bootstrap themes. Let's say awesome SaaS tutorial. This part, you'll probably want some marketing text here to sell your users on the product. Make sure they sign up for that free trial. So then you can say, definitely should sign up. It's an amazing product. And this find out more, I'm going to comment this out for now because I want to replace it with my signup form. Let's look for where this company logo is defined. Start Bootstrap. Oh, what we found instead is where the footer is. We need to change that as well though. So SaaS tutorial. Search for Start Bootstrap again though. That should be somewhere. Okay, that looks right because this comment says it's the navigation bar. This company logo looks like it's in the navigation bar, so it's probably this. SaaS tutorial. And then we're going to want to modify all these links here. We'll have one that goes to the login page and delete the rest. So let's search for something that sounds a little bit unique. So portfolio, that'll probably give us the right element. Oh yeah, it's over here, right? And then you can see, well, even if you don't know what this LI element is, you can sort of see that all these 4 links in the navigation bar, they sort of follow a similar structure. So if I want to create another one, like maybe I just copy another LI, right? Like that's how you learn HTML. You just sort of pick up the patterns. And I didn't need to restart the node server there, but you get the point, right? I have a bunch of different navigation links now. So let's delete all of them and just keep one called login. And if I refresh, new company logo, the new header, there's some additional writing, there's the footer. We're going to put our sign up form here, and then here's a login button. Let's copy over our form from our original page over to the new one. I'm going to put it under this part right here. So if I refresh, there you go. Bootstrap has some convenient classes we can use. If you say form control, it'll just stylize that form element. And for this button, I'm actually just going to copy over the classes from the original button on the page. But I'm going to omit this JS scroll trigger because previously you would press the button and it would scroll down, but we don't want to do that. We want to have the user sign up once they click the button. Refresh. That's looking pretty good, but I would like some spacing between these elements. So what you can do in Bootstrap, you can say MB, which means margin bottom, and then a number from 0 to 5, where 5 is the most margin. I'll put 3, and I'll copy that over here. Refresh, and that's looking even better. It would be good if we could redirect the user to the main page of our application after they sign up. So for now, we'll say that there is no email confirmation. Once they sign up, they'll be automatically logged in, and they'll go to the meat of the application where you would put whatever functionality you want to implement. So let's create main.ejs. And like before, we're going to start off with something very bare bones just to get it working, and then we'll stylize it with a theme from startbootstrap.com. So let's go back to our old index.ejs and copy that over. We do not need this stuff. I'll put the title as main page. Main page. Let's just leave everything blank for now. Inside app.js, we can copy over what we had for rendering the home page, but this time it's going to be /main, and it's going to be rendering the main.ejs file, and we don't need to pass in this variable for now. When they sign up successfully, you want to do res.redirect to the main page. I'm actually going to do that only if the new user was saved successfully. So you can pass in a callback function. If there is an error, just call next. Otherwise, redirect to the main page. Let's run that. Sign up with R at R. And we've successfully signed up because we know we went to the main page. Let's check Robo3T, refresh, and there is R at R.R. Let's do something similar for our login page. So I'll copy the contents of old index and create login page.ejs. We'll just say login, And this time we are going to keep the form, but our post request is going to be login. We need to define that afterwards. The email and password, yes, we need that. And also we need the submit button, but I will say login. Let's just link to this page from our landing page. So index.ejs, search for login, that login button we put. href is your link, so /login page. And then inside app.js, do app.get login page. Function rec res. Next, as always. You can actually skip the arguments if you don't need it. So I could just do rec res, for example, and then do res.render login page. Wow, what's happening? Can't type. You can't omit the request, because if you did that, the first argument is going to be the request. So you have to include the request, but you can skip next. I personally like keeping all three of those arguments there just for consistency in all my request handlers. So that should be good. Let's rerun. Localhost, go to login, and now we're on our login page. We still need to define this login post request that the form uses in our login page. But to do that, we're actually going to be using an authentication library called Passport.js. And before we integrate Passport, I have to teach you about a concept called an express session. So why do we need an express session? Well, right now, it's not easy to pass data between different requests. These requests, like the home request and the main requests, they're basically acting independently. So let me give you an example. What if, let's say your app was very complicated and you want your users to read a walkthrough page, right? You want them to read all these instructions before they actually dive into the meat of your app. You don't want them to be just blindly doing stuff without knowing what they're doing, kind of like what I'm doing. So if you have this page, I'm not actually going to make the HTML for it, but let's say it has something like this, right? And then later on you have the very complicated page, which you want to make sure that the user has read the walkthrough before they start diving into that page. So I'll say complicated. Yeah, like that. So is there some way that I can check when a user hits the complicated page? Did they read the walkthrough beforehand, or are they just trying to be courageous? And you might think, oh, well, you can just define a variable, right? You can say something like let saw walkthrough, something like that, and say once they go to the walkthrough page, you set this to true, and then we can log the variable inside complicated. Would that work? Well, let's test it out. So if I go to localhost 3000/complicated, nothing's going to render because I'm not rendering anything. Okay, we start off as undefined, which is correct. Now I'm going to go to the walkthrough. Okay. And then now I'm going to go back to the complicated page. And now the variable is true. So that should be correct, right? It was undefined in the beginning, and then they went to the walkthrough, and then now it's true. So now, you can change the functionality of what happens when the browser hits the complicated page, depending on whether or not the user saw the walkthrough. But this isn't actually working properly, because what happens if there's another user on the other side of the world? I'll open up a new incognito tab to represent that entirely different user. This could be a user, who knows nothing about that initial user. He never went through the walkthrough page. But what if I go to now localhost 3000/complicated? Our console is still going to be logging true for this variable. And that is because this variable, it's basically global for all the users hitting our web page. We don't want that. We want something that's specific to that browser session. And that's basically what express session enables you to do. We're going to npm install -- save express - session. Import it. And then we have to set it up in our middleware. Doesn't necessarily matter as long as you do it somewhere. Let's run it, and we get this thing, secret option required for sessions. So we basically have to pass in some unique string that's supposed to be secret to make it more secure. I'm not exactly sure how much more secure, but that's just what they're telling us to do. So make up some string. We will do something to make this more secure later, but for now I'm just going to make it really stupidly long. Refresh. Okay, we don't have the error anymore. So how do we use express session? Well, let's get rid of this variable that didn't work for us. And we can just set rec.session.saw walkthrough equals true. And then we have to end the request in order for it to save. So now we can console.log that in complicated, and let's see how this works. So I'm going to go to the complicated page first. Right now it's undefined, that's correct. Walkthrough. Okay. Now complicated again, and now it's true. Let's open up our incognito tab and go to the complicated page. And it's still undefined because this is a different browser session. Now we're ready to install Passport and handle user login. And the reason why we're using Passport is mainly because if you want to integrate other login methods in the future, such as Google login, Facebook login, Passport just makes it much easier. You don't have to bother looking at the APIs for all those different authentication methods. For basic email and password login, it actually makes things a little bit more complicated, but if you wanted to implement it manually, like by checking if the email and password matches something in the database, you're probably gonna change it eventually because nobody really does that anymore. So I thought it would be more useful to show you the practical thing to use. npm install -- save passport. Passport comes with different strategies. Strategy is an authentication method. We're just going to start off with the local strategy. It's passport local. Then we need to import both of them. So var passport equals require passport, and var local strategy equals require passport local, and we have to do .strategy at the end. We also need to set up Passport by adding some middleware functions. app.use passport.initialize, and then we have to set up Passport session. And basically what that's going to do is after a user is logged in, the user object is going to be stored in the session. So that's pretty convenient because I don't want to always be querying my database every time I want to view some data about the user or modify something about the user. It would be useful if I just had it immediately when the request was handled. Passport session. And that should be good. A lot of people like initializing Passport in another file. But we're not going to be doing any Passport stuff besides local signup and login. So I'm just going to do it in the same app.js file where most of our code is. We can look up the Passport local documentation to see how to use it. This is basically exactly what we want. So to handle the login post request, basically, we're going to send the request over to Passport.authenticate. If it fails, we're just going to stay on the login page. If it succeeds, we're going to go to the main page. Now we have to define what happens when we pass the request over to Passport.authenticate. So since we pass in this local string, that means we're using the local strategy. We imported it up here. So we have to define what exactly the local strategy does. And like I said earlier, Passport actually just makes local authentication more complicated than it should be, but unfortunately that's the way it is. So passport.use, you can look at this example template here. New local strategy. By default, if you use local strategy, it will be named lowercase local. So that's why when I pass in this string here, it'll be handled by the local strategy. So I can remove that because that's the default name. Now what the local strategy is going to do is it's going to look at the form data that was submitted. We have the email and the password. And then it's going to pass that form data to our callback function here. So the username field is going to be email because we put down email over here. Over here in the name. And then the password field is password. And this should be a string. These should both be strings. We do want to store the user in the session. As I said earlier, that is pretty convenient. So then our callback function, email, password, next. You can call these anything, but I like being consistent. I always call it next when I want to continue the execution flow, and email and password because those are the two input fields in our form. We are going to check now. Does this email exist in our database? User.find1. Email. And then our callback. Error or user. If there was an error, let's continue on. This will go to our failure redirect, which is the login page. Oh, this should actually be login page. If there is no user, or if it doesn't match our password. So we need to use bcrypt to compare, because remember we hashed the password, so we can't just compare it with equals equals. Use compare sync the password and the hash, which is user.password hash. So if either the user doesn't exist or the password is wrong, we want to return a custom error, and we will say user, or we'll say email or password incorrect. And then finally, if it's all good, we'll log in. Is this good yet? No, actually, this is not good yet. Why? Because if you imagine, if this user was huge, since we're storing the user in the session, this could potentially waste a lot of memory. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to define a couple functions. Passport.serializeUser, which takes in the user, and next, and also passport.deserializeUser, and this will take in the ID and also next. So what this lets us do is, instead of saving the entire user into the request session, we're actually just going to save the ID of the user. And then every time we want to access the user, we just query our database. So basically, this just makes things easier for me as the programmer because I don't have to write user.find1 every time I want to find the user. But in the back end, it is actually just querying the database to get my user back out from the ID that is saved in the session. So you want to call next with no error, because if you have the user, then all you need to do is underscore ID to get the automatically generated ID in MongoDB. If you look at our documents, you can actually see underscore ID, there's this big ID thing. And then in deserializeUser, user.find by ID, and then let's pass in the ID, function, error or user, and then we can actually just call next with error and user. Because if the error is null, then we will continue on. Otherwise, we will get the error. So now that should be good. We should be able to log in now. Let's go to our login page. Let's try q at q.q and q. And we're on the main page, which means we successfully logged in. Let's try something wrong. So blah, 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 login. And we got email or password incorrect, which is what we want. Now we need to refactor the signup to use Passport.js. The main reason to do this, besides the fact that we just want to be organized and use Passport for all our authentication, is because after they sign up, it's basically like they're getting logged in automatically, and we want to store the user into the session using these Passport serialize user and deserialize user methods. And in order to do that, we have to make use of the local strategy again. So this is very similar to what we did before. Let's just copy everything we had for login. This time though, we do have to define a name for this local strategy use case, because by default, it's just going to be local, and that would conflict with the naming of this. Once again, the input fields we care about are email and password. Let's replace this with what we had in signup. And we can just use the email without having to access rec.body. And after the new user is saved, we can just do this, because we want to go to next either way. Finally, okay, so this signup should take the same format as login, so let me just replace it with that. That's signup. So first, you have this passport.authenticate function that gets called with the request. Then you get your custom request handler. Again, we're redirecting to the main page. This needs to be signup local though. And the failure page, we'll just go back to the home page. That should be good. Let's restart. Let's try signing up t at t.t. Rec is not defined. Oh, yeah, I just forgot to remove that over here. And also over here. Let's try that again. T at t.t. And we're on the main page, which means we signed up successfully. Let's check our database. Okay, we have T at T. Let's try signing up with the same email. So this shouldn't work this time. Yeah, user already exists. Okay, so it's working correctly. Let's style our login and main pages now. This time we are going to use the SBadmin2 theme. I actually really like this theme. It's a dashboard style theme. It's very flexible. So once you've downloaded and extracted that, you want to copy CSS, IMG, JS, and vendor into your public folder. And some of this is going to be the same as the stuff we copied before for the creative theme, so we can just skip it. Skip for all. We will also want to copy over login.html and blank.html. Copy those over to views. We'll rename our login page to old login page. The new login.html, we will name that login page.ejs. Main.ejs. You can refactor also with Shift F6. So I'm going to rename this old main EJS, and blank is going to be main EJS. Okay, run again. Let's try logging in or going to the login page. Very nice. So let's fix up this login page first. I'm going to get rid of this remember me, login with Google, login with Facebook, and forgot password. I think the link to creating an account, we can just have a link back to the home page. That's fine. So let's search remember me. There you go. We can see that it's part of a form group. There is the checkbox and there is the label for it. Let's just delete all of that. HR is a line. That's this line here. Okay, this is the Google button, the Facebook button, the forgot password. So create an account, we'll just say home, and href our link back to the home page. Let's refresh this. That's looking pretty good. Does the home button work? Yep, it works. Okay, let's fix up our login form now. So if you take a look at this input, it's missing the name of the input, which is email. You have to make sure you have the name, because Passport.js, when it uses the local strategy, we're passing in the name string over here. So make sure you have the name for the email, name for the password, and for the button, we are actually, let's just make the button fresh because we want to make it a an input button, not this ahref thing, which is just a link. Usually, when you're submitting a form, you use input type equals submit. You don't just make a link and style it to look like a button. So that's actually all you need, because submit will submit the form, value, I will say login. And for the class, we will style it so that it looks like the old login button. And all we have to do is copy over the classes into here. Delete this. We need to define the action for the form, which is login, and then the method is post. Rerun, refresh. Let's try logging in. And we've logged in to our new and fancy looking dashboard main page. Time to do something very similar to this page. We're going to delete the top bar here. We're also going to delete most of the links in the sidebar, but we'll keep one for the main page where you can implement whatever functionality you want for your SaaS application. We will also change one of these to a billing page because one of the core components of a SaaS web app is some kind of recurring billing structure. And finally, we will have a logout button. So let's get started. Main.ejs. Let's look for a top bar. Do we see a top bar? Maybe we can search for this search for phrase. That's probably a placeholder somewhere. Search for, aha, top bar search. So probably, yeah, this is the top bar. Let's delete all of that. You may want to add this back in later if you need it, but let's keep things simple for now. Let's search for components. Okay. Everything from this divider down to this divider, I'm going to delete it. So I see a divider here. I'm going to watch out for tables. Where is tables? Tables. Aha, tables. Okay. And then divider below it, we can delete that as well. Refresh. All right. Dashboard, I'm gonna call main, and href is going to be /main. And let's just duplicate this list item to create billing, and let's duplicate it again for log out. This cute little icon beside it, beside these links, are from a CSS file called font awesome. So this is included in the vendor folder in the theme, and it's actually very convenient. You just search up font awesome icons. There's like a ridiculous amount of icons that you get just from linking this CSS file. So you can play around with that, but we're just going to keep it as is. You're probably going to want to put some margin on top of this blank page thing. So like before, margin top empty, I'm going to say 3. And let's rename this to main page. Yeah, main page. Looking good. This we probably want to replace as well. SB admin. Okay, let's change the title as well. SaaS tutorial main page. SB admin. We will change that to SaaS tutorial. And that's about all the changes we're going to make to this. Let's go ahead and implement the logout function now. It's very easy. So we will call this request logout and do app.get logout. What do we want to do on logout? The most important thing is to clear the user from the session, because if somebody else uses the same browser right after that, you don't want them to be able to mess around with the user data of the previous guy on the browser. So Passport actually makes it really easy to do this. You can actually just call rec.logout and that's it. And then after that, we will probably want to redirect them to the home page. So let's go res.redirect. Home. Let's try that out. Let's actually log in first though. Log out. And we're back to the home page. Let's copy over what we have on our main page to create our billing page. We're just going to rename the page so that it says billing. Let's search for main page inside the heading. Okay, let's change that to billing. Is there any more? In the title, billing. And oh, we need to update the links. Let's go back to the main page as well. Yeah, the billing page needs to go to the billing link. Okay, so now we need to handle the billing page request. Simply render the billing page for now. If you test it out, it should look pretty boring, but it should work. There's the billing page. We can go back to the main page, back and forth, and so on. So what do we want to do on the billing page? Well, we want to implement some kind of recurring payment, right? For this tutorial, I'm just going to say it's a monthly subscription plan, and there's only one pricing tier. So we're going to use the Stripe API, probably the most common API for subscription payments right now. Stripe is a third-party API, which means that their code is running on the Stripe servers, not our servers, like all the Node modules we've been previously using. To use Stripe, we're going to have to look into their documentation. And I thought it was important to include this in the tutorial because as a web developer, you'll be spending tons of time reading documentation on different APIs. So I thought I should give you a taste of what it's like. So Stripe has several APIs we can use to integrate into our Node web app. And we're going to be using Stripe Checkout because, as they say, this is the fastest way to get started with Stripe. I'm not particularly interested in the slower way to get started with Stripe. So let's click Start Now. Stripe creates a secure Stripe-hosted payment page that lets you collect payments with just a few lines of code. So basically, you click a checkout button and it brings you to a Stripe checkout page. They buy the thing and then redirects the user back to your homepage. They even have a demo that we can use. Always good to try out the demo if they have one in the documentation. Just put in whatever. On Stripe, you can actually test payments by jamming in 4 twos in the card information. Useful fact. The rest of it can be whatever you want. So after this, it should redirect us back to the documentation page. And it even says, welcome back, you successfully completed a test purchase. Okay, let's get started with a recurring payment. We would like to learn how to start new subscriptions with checkout. And that's pretty convenient, right? A 3-step plan. Okay. Step 1, create products and plans. So we actually need to create a Stripe account for this. I already created a new account for myself. Make sure you are in test mode. You should have this little orange thing saying test data. And click add a test product. We're going to add a recurring product. It's going to be called SaaS tutorial product. You can skip these two, add a pricing plan. Plan nickname, we'll call it monthly. We don't need the ID. Recurring quantity, we will charge in American monies. Some American monies, let's say $10 per unit. Month is good. We don't need to worry about the trial for now, the preview. A customer subscribed to 1 unit will be billed $10 at the beginning of each month. That's fine. Add the pricing plan. And we have created our product and pricing plan. What's next? Step 2, create a checkout session on your server. Okay, this is actually a little bit confusing. Basically, we have to create this Stripe object called a checkout session, and this gives us a session ID. And then we pass that session ID to Stripe when we redirect a user to the Stripe checkout page. The Stripe actually has another API where you don't have to create this checkout session object. And I actually thought that was less confusing, but they're saying this is the fastest way to integrate Stripe into your server. So we're just going to follow their directions. Okay, they have different languages available. Let's look at what they have for Node. And we will copy all this stuff in. Put it in right here. We will need to npm install --save Stripe. This test key here, it was automatically filled in because I'm already logged in. So for you, it should be something different if you copy it from the documentations when you're reading it on Chrome or whatever browser. That's good. We're not going to bother with this async await stuff. Let's just cut this. So what we're going to do is on the billing page, when the user navigates to the billing page that we just created, we're going to create this checkout session object. And then if they click the pay now button, then we're going to pass the ID, the session ID, over to Stripe when the user goes to the checkout page. And then hopefully it's successful, and then they go back to our page. So go to billing, paste all that stuff over here. This is definitely not going to work yet. First of all, let's find our pricing plan. We should have some ID, and we need to add that over here. The success URL, we can use HTTP localhost for testing, 3000. For now, we'll just go back to the billing page. It's all right. And then this session ID thing. So when Stripe redirects the user back to our web page, they're also going to give us back the checkout session ID in the URL. So this is going to be something that's populated by the Stripe servers. In the cancel URL, it's all right. We'll just also use billing for now. How about we just copy all of this actually? So what we need now is to wait for this function to give us back the session object. And then we can pass that session ID over to the billing EJS template. And then if the user clicks the pay now button, then we redirect them to Stripe with that checkout session ID. Let's add in our callback function. There's an error. Let's continue to the error page. Otherwise, we want to pass in the session ID, session.id. Inside billing.ejs, we need to make a button under the page heading. We will say subscribe for $10 a month. Good deal. And we have to define a function that gets called when the button is clicked. We'll say go to checkout. To define that JavaScript function, just use the script tag in HTML, and then you can write whatever JavaScript you want. Let's see what Stripe has to say about redirecting to checkout. We need to add the following script tag on our website. Okay, let's do that. We need to create an instance of the Stripe object, but providing your publishable API key as the first parameter. Copy that. To use checkout on your website, you must add a snippet of code. And then we need to call redirect to checkout. Okay, so we don't want to redirect right when the page is loaded. We want to wait until the button is clicked. So you find the go to checkout button. And then put this in. This is our EJS template variable. So it is session ID. And one more thing we need to do. I just noticed here in this pre-filling customer data section that we can actually pre-fill the customer's email when we create the session. So we're going to want to do that because we have the email. It is just rec.user.email. And that should be it. Let's run it. Let's go to login page, log in, billing, subscribe to $10 a month. It works. And we see the pre-populated email here too. So let's just jam that in, jam that in, jam that in. That was really slow, but it eventually worked. Okay, and we're back to the billing page now. And the session ID is in the URL right here. Now, just being able to subscribe is not very useful. We need to be able to check whether or not the user is currently subscribed to the subscription plan so that we can alter the functionality of the web app accordingly. So let's add a property to the user model called subscription active, and we can even give this a default value. So if you pass in a JavaScript object instead of just the type, you can do type boolean and then default false. And now we want to toggle this to be true when the payment is successful. And we're not going to bother with canceling plans right now, but then eventually you'll probably want to do that too. So in the billing page, let's pass in subscription active, rec.user.subscription active. So we're going to now use some EJS to disable this subscribe for $10 a month button if the user is already subscribed. Previously, we only used EJS when we want to replace something with a variable, but we can actually use it to run any arbitrary amount of code. If we don't need it to replace some value, then we just get rid of this equal sign here. So what you can do is if subscription active and then close it like this. So this is just code that's going to be run on the server side, and then it's going to alter this HTML file, because if it's active, we're actually going to show some text that says, thanks for subbing. Otherwise, we will show the button. So for now, it should show the button because we haven't toggled subscription active yet. Yeah. So you might be thinking that when we created the checkout session on our billing page, this success URL should probably be where we toggle subscription active to true, right? Like after they pay, it goes to this success URL. But take a look at the Stripe documentation. Next steps after the payment. Do not rely on the redirect to the success URL alone for fulfilling purchases. Malicious users could directly access the success URL. Customers may not always reach the success URL after successful payment. So what we actually want to do is use this concept called a webhook. A webhook is a very common concept among different APIs. Basically, it's when the third-party API makes a call back to your server instead of your server calling the third-party API. So it says Stripe can send webhook events to notify you when a customer completes their payment. So when a customer completes the payment, we should be receiving some request from Stripe. And then in that request handler, we want to toggle subscription active to true. Let's take a look at how this is set up. We have already required Stripe over here. But what is this endpoint secret? We have to find it in our dashboard's webhook settings. That means first we go to our dashboard, and under developers, there's this webhooks thing, and then we can create an endpoint. So this is the URL that Stripe is going to try to hit once a payment is successful. But there's a problem, because normally you can only put in publicly accessible URLs. Stripe cannot send a request to my computer, which is not publicly accessible. So how do I test this webhook? Well, Stripe has given us a tool called the Stripe CLI. This is a new tool. I've never actually tried it before. But most APIs, when they offer webhooks, they do not offer this kind of thing to test it locally. So you have to figure out a solution on your own. And the solution I like to use is called ngrok. Secure introspectable tunnels. Go ahead and download this. It's very, very straightforward. All it does is expose one port on your computer to a publicly accessible URL. So on my desktop, I have ngrok over here. There's a version of this for Mac too. It works basically the same. Now I'm going to type ngrok http 3000. And this is the publicly accessible URL, which points to my web server. So if I just go to that URL, ta-da! Okay, now in Stripe, I can make that as my endpoint URL. And then I'm going to add some path to it. So let's just say pay success. And the event we want to send is the session completed, checkout session completed. Add endpoint. Okay, now before we send the test webhook, we have to copy all this stuff. Endpoint secret. What is our endpoint secret? Don't worry, this is a test account. I'm not giving you confidential information. Okay, we need this body parser thing. This basically does some parsing of the data that's sent to us. We are actually already doing some parsing using this express.json middleware. And so it's gonna mess it up if we do this parsing and also this body parsing. So what we have to do is we actually have to do this part above this use of express.json. So I'm just gonna do it. I'm gonna do it right over here. I need to npm install --save body parser, and this endpoint should be pay success. And for now, let's just console.log the session so we can take a look at it. Rerun. Let's send the test webhook. Timestamp outside the tolerance zone. That was really stupid. What happened was, it's daylight savings today, and stupid Windows computer didn't sync the time, so then Stripe couldn't send the request to my computer because the time was wrong. Anyways, it's working now. So if I hit send the test webhook, this stuff is gonna log over here. Alright, so let's actually try it for reals this time. Let's run this again. Log in. Subscribe for 10 bucks a month. Subscribe. And this is the session. Okay. Once we get to this part over here where Stripe put in the comment fulfill the purchase, we want to set subscription active to true. But there's a couple other things we want to do. If we look at this session that we just logged, we also get things such as this subscription ID. This is very useful because maybe the user will want to change their pricing plan, maybe they'll want to cancel the plan. So you'll need this subscription ID so that they can modify it. You'll also get this customer ID, and this is useful because if the user makes different purchases, you want to associate with the same customer ID on Stripe. So we'll want to save all of those. Let's make customer ID. We can make that a string, and let's make subscription ID string. We can't actually access the user by just doing rec.user because it's not the web browser making this request, it's Stripe's server. So what we have to do is user.find one. And fortunately, we have the email, the customer email that we pre-populated. So just look for that user, actually. It will be the session.customer email. And then the callback, error user. We don't care too much about handling errors because this is just Stripe's server making this call. So if it fails, like there's no UX problem. So let's just check if there's a user, and then if there is, we will set the subscription active equals true. We will set equals session dot subscription, which we can actually just copy from here, and then user dot customer ID equals session dot customer. Save it, and now when we rerun, if we purchase, we should get that thanks for subbing text. Subscribe for 10 bucks a month. Subscribe to this channel. Nice, perfect. I realized I forgot to stylize the subscribe for 10 bucks a month button. So because I'm OCD, let's just do that right now. Class equals, we'll just make it button and button. We can play around with some different ones that Bootstrap and this theme provides. Let's make it button large and button. Is there like success? Yeah, there's a success button, right? Yeah, because buying is like success. Money is happiness. Okay, let's create a new account. I. It's looking good. It still works too. One more thing you're gonna want to do before we deploy this to our web server is remember all these API keys like this one, SKTest, or this endpoint secret, basically all these secure credentials. We want to pull them out into another file, and there's two reasons for this. So first of all, most likely the keys that you use for testing and production is not going to be the same. So it would be convenient if you had one file that you can swap out. And the second reason is that it's not very secure to commit these keys to your source code. Some people are a little bit paranoid about who might potentially be looking at the source code. I'm not one of those people, but I can sort of see their concern. So this is actually a very easy problem to fix. In the root directory, just create a .env file. That's where we're gonna be storing all these keys. And then we want to do npm install -save.env. Need to do var.env equals require.env, and then we say .env.config. And now, for something like this, the Stripe secret key, we can just do process.env.stripe secret key and say inside .env stripe secret key equals blah blah, and then just repeat for everything that you want to store in there. So endpoint secret, actually we can just get rid of this entire variable. Endpoint secret equals this. Where do we use endpoint secret? It is right here, process.env.endpoint secret. What else do we have? We have the express session, this one. So process.env.express session secret. Okay, and we also have the Stripe public key that's inside the billing page. That's this thing. So we actually need to pass this in as a EJS template variable. So Stripe public key. Let's look for billing. Pass in Stripe public key. Process.env.stripe public key. Let's put that in here. And hopefully you get the idea. Any other credential you want to store, you can do it like that. I think that's all. Oh wait, we also have the plan. Process.env.stripe plan. And that should be it. Let's run it again. Let's create another user. Okay, let's try going to the checkout page. Yeah, looks like it's working. Subscribe. Thanks for subbing. Main, billing, log out. Okay, let's try logging in again. g@g.g. Yeah, looks good. Now that we've done the hard work of building our web app, it's time to put it on the internet. And you can follow the ending of this tutorial with any VPS provider, but I'm going to be using Hostinger. And let me just give you a very, very brief walkthrough of their website. So I'm going to be using their most basic plan. 1 vCPU, 1 gig of memory, and 20 gigs of storage. This is already way more powerful than we need for testing purposes. So after you purchase that, then you will see, once you've logged in, it'll say pending setup. You just need to click this setup button. And then the important thing to do is set a password that you'll use to connect to your server via your terminal. You don't need to set the SSH key for now, though you'll probably do it later for convenience. You want to click 18.0.464-bit Ubuntu, probably the most common Linux distribution to use for your server. Then click Continue to Control Panel and click Start. Eventually this will change to executing. We just need to wait a little bit longer. Okay, it's a few minutes later and the server status will change to running. And that's actually all we need to do inside Hostinger. The credentials we need to log in to our server is over here. My favorite part about Hostinger is that you don't really have to think about it. They walk you through all the setup steps, and then after that you can just dive right in and connect to your server. The features that they do include in their control panel are pretty nifty. For example, there's this statistics page, and you can use this to visually see if there are any performance problems with your server. So maybe you didn't optimize your code very well, or maybe there's a malicious user using a lot of system resources. Well, this will give you a quick overview to diagnose these problems. If you'd also like to get a Hostinger VPS, then you can just go to hostinger.com/WillQuan with the coupon code WillQuan to get up to 91% off. Thanks again, Hostinger, for sponsoring this video. Now we have to connect to our VPS from our terminal so that we can install all the programs we need and get our web app running. So you can actually just copy this command in the Hostinger control panel under the SSH details and paste it into your terminal. It will work in Windows, Mac, or Linux, but on Windows, just make sure to use the Windows PowerShell, the new terminal, not like the old thing that they used to have. Yes, you want to continue connecting, and then the password that you use to set up Hostinger. And now we're connected. Now you're going to want to install Node.js and MongoDB so that we can get our web app running. And there's going to be lots of different tutorials you can find on this. And this is going to sound really obvious, but you want to follow the one that's official and not what somebody said on Stack Overflow or something. So I found them for you. This is on the GitHub page for Node. Let's do that first. Search for Ubuntu. Installation instructions. Okay, we want Node.js v12. That's the latest stable release right now. So let's just copy that. Note that when you see a command with sudo, you need that if you're using a user with more restricted privileges, but by default, we are the root user, which means we can do whatever. So we can actually omit this sudo part of the command, but it doesn't hurt to include it as anyways. And that's good for the Node.js installation. This will also install the npm package manager for us. So now we need to install MongoDB. Let's copy and paste step 1 over here. You will be doing lots of copy and pasting once you start learning server administration. Step 2 over here. This is kind of annoying stuff to do, but you only have to do it when you set it up the first time. And then after that, it's pretty smooth sailing. Step 3. And then step 4. I know some people prefer using Heroku or things like that to make this installation process a little bit easier. But honestly, like, you just need to do this once for your server and then you're good. And like, you save a lot of money using VPS. Besides the fact that it's good to be able to have these skills. And that should be good for a Mongo installation. One optional step that I always do is set up credentials on MongoDB. So by default, your Mongo database will only be accessible by other programs that's running on the same server. But this is a little bit inconvenient. I would like to be able to open up Robo3T and view my database remotely. So if I'm allowing that, then you have to make sure you have a username and password on the Mongo database so that you don't allow random people to access the database. First thing you gotta do is actually start the Mongo database. And just continue on the same official tutorial. The link is in the description. So we use the service command to start Mongo in the background. And then it'll also show you how to stop and restart. So to connect to the Mongo database, you can use the terminal client just by typing Mongo, and by default, it will connect to the one running on the same server. Now, what you want to do is go to this other tutorial that I found for you. I'm sorry, there's no way I can remember all these commands in my head, so I do have to copy and paste them. Like I said, you just do it once. So, step 1, we've already done it. Start MongoDB without access control. But you don't want to be doing this. You want to be starting it with a service because this is just a much easier way to do it. Basically, this is making it easy to manage the Mongo database process. Connect to the instance. We've already done that. Create the user administrator. So first, we have to do this. Use admin. Why is that? So remember
we created a database on our test MongoDB server that was called SaaS tutorial database. And we can create as many databases as we want in Mongo. But by default, there's this database called admin. And what admin is for is managing the different credentials for people that you're letting use your Mongo server. So what you need to do first is create this administrator user. And this administrator user will then let us create a specific user for our SaaS tutorial database. So copy this in. Then we've got to enter the password. That's good. Now we have to restart the MongoDB instance with access control. And we're actually going to deviate a little bit from the tutorial here because we used sudo service. The other useful thing that the service command lets you do is that it will start up Mongo using a configuration file, so you don't have to pass in a ton of parameters like this every time you start it up. So the configuration file is located at /etc/mongo.conf, and we need to edit it, so we're going to be using a text editor called Nano, which is the easiest text editor to use that's pre-installed on Ubuntu. Look for the line that says security and uncomment that and add authorization enabled. Like that, make sure it's a string, and then look for the line that says bind IP under net. What this means over here, 127.0.0.1 is a local host, so it says only let other programs that are running on the same IP address connect to this database. But we would like to be able to connect to the database remotely just by opening up Robo3T on whatever computer. So the easiest way to do that is it just changes to 0.0.0.0, which means accept all remote connections. This might not be the most secure, but as long as we add the password, it should be good enough. So exit. Now we need to restart Mongo using service Mongo restart. And now we've restarted Mongo with the authorization enabled and allowing remote connections. Let's go on to step 5 of enabling access control in MongoDB. So now we need to start up the Mongo client again using the credentials we just created. We actually use the same myuseradmin username as a tutorial, so we can just copy that and then our password. Okay, and now we need to create additional users, and this user is going to be specific to our web application database. So let's just open that up again to check what we named it. We named our database SaaS tutorial DB, and now I need to shut off WebStorm because my computer is going to explode. Use SaaS tutorial DB. Okay. Now we need to create the user just for this database. Let's just copy this and edit it a little bit in Notepad. Okay, we do not need this reporting database. This test database should be SaaS tutorial DB. Read and write is fine. The user will say web app, password prompt, that's fine. Should be good. Paste that in. And we've created our user for our web app.
Quick pause. Okay. I know that it might be very intimidating if you're a beginner and you see me just typing in all these Linux commands. For me, it took me several years of Googling and forgetting stuff to learn all these skills. And even now, I forget stuff all the time. So I just wanted to point you towards the Hostinger tutorial section, which is a handy collection of hundreds and hundreds of articles. So if you're a beginner, it's very nice to have all this information at one place. And I'll point you out towards 2 articles, which I think are just generally useful. So first of all is 30 Linux commands that every user should know. So even if you're not using Hostinger, this is like a good getting started guide to Linux. And then the second article, if you are using Hostinger, is how to point the domain towards VPS. So this is very important because once you actually get the functionality of your website working, you will want to go live on a real domain name as fast as possible. It's kind of weird to send people an IP address, right? So you can follow this article and they make it very straightforward. All right, that's it. Back to the video.
we are very close to putting our web app on the internet. Just a few small changes we need to make. So inside this mongoose.connect call, we need to put in our credentials. We're going to do that using the .env file again. So let's make a Mongo username equals web app. That's the thing we called it. And then Mongo password is the the password I put before. I'll just put in some stuff. This is not what I actually used, but you get the point. So before localhost, you have to put in process.env.mongo username plus the colon plus process.env.mongo password plus, and then before localhost, make sure to put the @ Okay, that's looking good. Now remember, we had those callback functions from Stripe in slide billing. We need these to go to our actual IP address. So an easy way to swap this out is to use another variable inside the .env file. So we can say base URL equals this, and then like for testing you can use this http://localhost, but then for your actual thing you would want to use your IP address, which you can find by typing in ifconfig, and then it's this one at the bottom here. So for me it's this 31.220.109.198. So for my production environment, I will change this to that IP address. Change this to process.env.base URL. Do the same over here. We're still going to be using port 3000. You might want to change that once you publicly launch, but for testing purposes, it's okay just to send an IP and port to somebody. Inside your Stripe dashboard, you're going to need to create another webhook that goes to your IP address. If you have a domain and you already set that up, then you'd want to use that, but we don't have one right now. So I'm just going to use the IP address, remember, port 3000, and our endpoint was pay success. We want to send the checkout session completed. I'm still doing this in test mode. You can see test data over here. But when you actually go public, you want to make sure that you're not in test mode. You go into a Stripe Live mode. But yeah, that is our new webhook. Note that we have a new signing secret here. So when we set up the environment variables on our production server, we want to use this new signing secret. We are almost ready to push our code to our server. I'm going to be pushing it on GitHub, and then on my server I'm going to be cloning it from GitHub. So one thing we want to do is to add a git ignore file so that we don't push all of the files. I'll send a link to this git ignore file. It just helps you remove some of the JetBrains specific stuff that we don't need. We're also going to add node modules because some of these modules they work different on Linux and Windows, so you actually want to install it fresh on your Linux server. We're also going to add .env because remember, we want to set that up separately for our public server. Now we can do git init, git add everything, that's git add -a, git commit init, and now I'm going to make a GitHub repository to push my code to. I'm going to make this public so that you guys can have access to all the code, but you might want to make yours private. Okay, we don't need this stuff for now. We've already initialized on our end, so let's just add this. And then git push origin master. code is on GitHub now. Now we can pull it from our server. I'm just gonna clone it into the root directory, and by that I mean /root, not like the outermost root. Anyways, let's clone this. Oh, git command not found. How do we install git? Apt install git. Let's try that again. Actually, let's use the up key to use your previous command. And there's our repo. Navigate to your repo and create the .env file, nano.env, and then you have to remember to put in all those environment variables here. I am just going to copy over what I had here, but you're going to want to use whatever keys you have. Yeah, so this stuff is all wrong, but I'm going to change this on my end off camera. Inside your SaaS tutorial project directory, do npm install to install all those node modules that we omitted in our Git repository. Okay, so bcrypt has some issues on Ubuntu. You actually have to copy this line here to install build essential Python, so I'll have that link in the description. Let's do that. One of the problems of having a very modular programming environment like Node is that you have random people all over the world making this stuff, so it's very likely that something like this is going to break. Like right now we have bcrypt compatibility problems with Linux. I did not have that the last time I tried to use bcrypt. But anyways, alright, let's npm install again. Okay, it works now. We're also going to want to install PM2. PM2 is basically a thing that will help us manage our Node server, and the main advantage is that it will automatically restart the Node server if it crashes, so you don't have to manually go into the server and restart the web app. So npm install -g. -g means install this globally on the machine, not just specific to this project. PM2. And now PM2 start. Make sure to run this command from the root directory of your project. Otherwise, the .env file will not get found correctly. So PM2 start /bin/www, and then we can give this a name, so we'll call it SaaS tutorial. That should be good. And it started. It's time for the grand finale. So let's go to our IP address in our browser and port 3000. And isn't that amazing? This is our website. You can go ahead and share your IP address and port to all your friends, show it off to your mom or whatever. Let's try signing up. The main page, so that's good. Let's go to the billing page, make sure Stripe works properly. Okay, we are redirecting to Stripe. The test card. Again, when you actually go live, you want to make sure that you enable Stripe to live mode, and then you won't be able to jam in this fake stuff. Processing. Thanks for subbing, so that's good. Okay, let's try logging out. Okay, log in again. Looks about right. Let's try connecting to our database from Robo3T. We should be able to see our user. Create. We will call this as tutorial. Our IP. 27017 is correct. For a database port, perform authentication, we do need that. Our username was password. Your password is whatever you set it. Let's test. Oh wait, we also have to change this to SaaS tutorial DB. I was too excited. Save. Connect. And there's our user. This is our user. Customer ID, subscription ID are both there. Subscription is active too. It's all looking good. That's it for this tutorial. If you made it this far, I hope I didn't scare you away too much from web development. The next steps from here would be to actually modify this code and make something cool. You don't want to be the kind of person who just watches one tutorial after another and doesn't do anything with it. You actually have to apply your creative skills and make something unique in order to really understand all the concepts. So if you do customize this code, just send me a DM on Twitter or Instagram and I'd be happy to check it out and give you some feedback. Anyways, thanks again to Hostinger for sponsoring this video. And thanks for you guys for watching all the way. And I'll see you in the next one. Peace.